Aloha. Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. Interviews with folks who have special insights in education from preschool all the way through higher ed. We stream live every Wednesday, and these are also posted on YouTube and the Hawaii Educational Policy Center website. I'm Jim Shon, your host, and today's special guest is Corey Rosenlee, the new 3-week-old president of the Hawaii State Teachers Association. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, but you primarily have been a social studies teacher, right?
I've been a teacher for 18 years, and I even started teaching while I was in high school.
Wow. So what drew you into that?
My mom was a teacher. She taught here in Hawaii. My dad was a professor at UH and, primarily concerned with teaching. And so, I always say it started with the red ball. My dad would used to bring this red ball to one of his classes to do group work with. And I always thought, wow, that was so much fun. I wanted to go into teaching like that. And when I was in school, I was always thinking of ways to make lessons better. So for me, it just feels natural to move into teaching.
And why social studies in particular?
I think there's two reasons. I remember growing up, my dad would take me to battlefields and we'd see all this history. But, as I look at it as an adult, I think there was a strong vein of social justice in my family. And one of my classes, my favorite class to teach is sociology. And sociology is about becoming aware of social rules. But then the next step is how to change them. And I think that when I finally started teaching that class, I realized this is what I truly love, is the idea of looking at our problems in society and how we make them better.
So do you, as a historian, have a favorite period of history that you particularly enjoy?
My main topic was American history.
Okay.
And I would say 20th century American history. You're looking at something like World War II, the Civil Rights era. No, but I wouldn't say that I would say there's one period of time that I would gravitate to. No, I mean, whenever I was teaching history, this is my favorite part. And then next week later, no, this is my favorite part.
Yes.
And sociology the same way, is that each part I felt was important on its own.
Now, there are a whole number of requirements for social studies in high school. Do you have any thoughts on the sequence that we're asking students to go through? A 9th grade brain is different than a 12th grade one?
I like that at the end, the way I taught it, is the final year, the senior year that I was teaching was psychology and sociology. Because you have all these components of all these histories, but then at the end of it, the question is now, what do you go do with it? And to be honest with you, I think the best way is whatever the school determines. Some of them try to go from 9th grade to Hawaiian history, then US, then world. But a lot of times, what decides what classes will be taught now is the testing.
Yes.
If they have, a year-end course exam, they have to teach appropriately to that, and that often determines it rather than what is the best way.
So you mentioned testing, and I've often thought maybe it's a great blessing that social studies is not part of No Child Left Behind, right?
I taught on the mainland for a couple of years, and they had testing. And basically what I did was, for 8 months out of the year, I taught the way I wanted, and then I crammed in the material for the test. Yes, but I was very happy that testing doesn't, because testing oftentimes is, especially for social studies, is the memorization of data.
Right.
Who did what, when, where, and that's not what social studies should be. It's looking at what this data is and thinking about it, and what do we learn from it. So I never gave my students tests. For my class, they wrote. They did essays. And that way they had to make an argument and support that argument. I felt that's what they do in college, that's what they do in the real world, and it's not, it's not about some sort of bubble test that they're filling in something. I avoided that as much as possible.
So much of history is written, although in the 20th century we have a lot of film now. Have you had seen it as a challenge that You know, the traditional repository of history is the textbook, but we have a generation of youngsters now who are much more visually oriented. It's the video literacy of the day. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of tension, maybe?
I had a bunch of textbooks and they sat in the back of my class.
I see.
Okay, and what I would do is bring in articles that were interesting, or have the kids look at different perspectives. Because when they're trying to make an argumentative essay, you want to have different approaches in doing this.
Right.
And I would bring in film clips and try to have the kids look at it. You know, I think that for me, it was important to get away from read the chapter, answer the questions.
Right.
It's more like, okay, how can you use this? So if you're looking at an event like, even something like the Vietnam War, okay, so now let's look at something like what's going on in, you know, Iraq and Syria, and what are the relationships? What can we learn from the Vietnam War that helps us to understand current events? And for sociology, it was always contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about, you know, race and racism, whether it's what's going on in, you know, New York or Baltimore, North Carolina, it was so easy to bring in contemporary events so the kids can understand what they're seeing on the news to have a broader perspective.
Mm-hmm. I could see where sociology, you might have a lot more elasticity in what you're doing, but by golly, our students are going to learn American history, and by golly, they're going to learn geography and things like that. So when you go to that body of work and the standards and the benchmarks, that's a pretty full plate for covering American history in high school in 1 year, isn't it?
And that's why I think sometimes when they try to have this guided curriculum, when I was in Virginia, my wife and I moved there for a couple of years, they had a prescribed thing that the kids had to know. 16 pages on World War II, 3 pages on the Civil Rights Movement. Now, who made that determination?
Right.
Okay, the Montgomery bus boycott was ignored, but the Battle of El Alamein was included, which is not saying that's not important, but, okay, you know, is it as important as these two things? And so I think oftentimes they're trying to prescribe what kids learn. And one of the things I'm very jealous of when I look at, we had a chance to go visit Punahou High School, is the teachers there sometimes get to teach to their passion.
Right.
So if they have, say, for example, a passion on the Civil War, they could offer a class on that. And I think what that does for the students is that they get a teacher that's very passionate on the subject, that really knows it well, and they'll take away that passion.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if we try to say you have 2 weeks to teach this and 2 weeks to teach that, we're getting away sometimes from the passion of the teacher, and we're also prescribing on what kids should know, and I think that's not necessarily the way to go.
So in some ways, you're challenging this whole standards movement, aren't you?
Oh, I absolutely hate the standards movement. I think that academic freedom is essential. You know, my wife is a professor, and we trust professors oftentimes. Okay, they have a course of study, but within that course of study, they have some leeway of what their specific knowledge is and what their passion is, and to allow them to teach. And that is a trend that you find in not just colleges, but you're going to find in our private schools, and you're going to find some of the best school systems around the world. And we're going the opposite way. Instead of it being more passion, it's becoming more prescribed. And I do not like that trend.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, in Hawaii, there is one group of public schools that by law have some authority over their curriculum, right? And those are the charters, and particularly the Hawaiian community has really taken that and run with it, almost half of the charters. Do you see maybe wanting to move in a direction where the school, as a school community, has much more authority over what that curriculum would be?
Not just the schools, but the teachers.
Uh-huh.
You know, we have to trust teachers to be the professionals that they are. And the idea right now is we don't trust them. We say, if we don't give you a prescribed curriculum and a prescribed test, then the education will not occur.
Right.
And they don't say, okay, you know what, we trust you guys. You guys are professionals. You know your kids better than anyone else. Mm-hmm. What do you feel is the best way to teach them? And many times these teachers are educational experts. They do their research. They find out what other schools are, and they're excited to try new things. But when we try to prescribe it, we take away not only the professionalism, but that ability to create, to be creative.
Not to pigeonhole different disciplines, but it does strike me that the social studies teacher world is a little more of a feisty group in this respect. Do you find that?
You can find them across the board, but social studies, I think that a lot of social studies teachers go into teaching because of that social justice belief, but I do not think it's only them. But the idea of history as a lesson, okay, and I always put it this way, when I was teaching in my classroom, every day you're telling your kids to go out and change the world, and eventually you feel like a hypocrite if you're saying, okay, you kids go do something, and I'm not.
Yes.
And so what I always made my students do is to pick an activism project. And that sometimes was not the most popular thing, because sometimes that would be directly challenging the school, or it would be challenging the legislature. But I think that's what they're going to remember the most, because they tried to change something. Some of the great projects were kids just even making sure that they had a healthy alternative for lunch, and that one got passed, or making sure lunch is available, or a bike rack at school, or, we took my students organized the air conditioning rallies, and we brought out a couple hundred kids to the state legislature to push for air conditioning. And what was great about that is they learned how to write a bill, write testimony. They learned how to track a bill. They learned how to, be involved in the political process. So I think sometimes that's the most valuable lesson that I could have given my students.
It sounds like you very much embrace this idea of project-based learning, whether it be STEM or social studies or writing a novel or whatever it might be. I don't know. Is that?
I would add a project component, but most of the time what I wanted was my kids to think. Okay, what do you guys think about this? Okay, how does this involve your life? I saw social studies as being something that was relevant. It wasn't just, dead people. And I think that at the end, if they could take what we did in class and apply it to their own lives, it was very interesting. I mean, when I was teaching gender to my students, I said, okay, what is typical of what you considered a male gender behavior and female gender behavior? And they had to switch and look at these different things there. But I think that also challenged to think, okay, well, why do women have to wear high heels? These are very uncomfortable.
Yes.
Okay, is this really what's healthy for them? And I think that having those kind of questions and starting to think about why are we doing things, I mean, that's a trivial one, but they had some real issues that we were looking at that these kids had to explore.
And I assume also that part of this is, can you put yourself in someone else's shoes, whether it be a gender issue today or Ulysses S. Grant in the 1860s or Abraham Lincoln or wherever. It's that transportation into another person's life and world and understandings.
So when starting this job, it's been amazing to me how many times I feel that the classes I taught are so relevant to actually being the president of HSTA. Understanding, Hawaiian history gives you a good perspective of why schools in Hawaii have inequality. When you look at class in America, and you look at how poverty is increasing and class inequality is growing in this country, that was something I was already teaching and talking about with my students. And so, believe it or not, I found it to be more often than not an easy transition, because a lot of these things that we were talking about are the same things that plague our society.
Fascinating how one job spills over to another. We're talking with Corey Rosenlee, the president of the Hawaii State Teachers Association. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Okay, this is ThinkTech Hawaii, and it's Wednesday. Every Wednesday is Energy Wednesday here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy. 4 to 5 p.m. every Wednesday. Come and listen to us. And just to show you what I mean, I'm going to ask Sharon to tell us more.
come and see us every Wednesday, as Jay said. And we have people like Jim Albers from HECO here and co-host Ray Starling here every Wednesday. We not only go on Olelo and OC16, but also stream live. So please come visit us, hear about the latest in clean energy.
Okay, Jim, you've been here. You got any comment on all this?
As important as energy is in all of our lives today, this is a great forum and a great format to vet those issues. So I encourage everybody to listen in and participate.
Okay, Ray, what do you think for a close?
Well, I think this is the greatest show in the energy world here in Hawaii. You can come here every week, 1 hour, and catch the latest on what's happening and hear from the people who really know what's going on, like Jim Alberts. We appreciate your coming today.
Thank you.
Ray Starling, Sharon Moriwaki, Jim Alberts, and Jay Fidel here in Hawaii, the state of clean energy, 4 to 5 p.m. Wednesday. Aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha, welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. We're talking with the president of the Hawaii State Teacher Association for 3 weeks, Corey Rosenlee. And I wanted to get into how you've been associated 18 years or whatever. Now you're in charge of a very important leadership position for all the, 13,000 teachers, right? How do you see our public schools as challenges for these teachers?
You know, we have great inequality in our country and we have great inequality in our schools. If you look at our country, the vast amount of wealth is going to the top 10%, and you have the 90% often struggling. And the same thing applies in our schools. Our schools in Hawaii are underfunded. A regular ed public student in Hawaii costs the DOE about $8,000. At our private schools in Hawaii, it costs 2 to 3 times as much they spend. And the reason why they spend that much is that how much it costs to educate a student. And if you look at schools across the mainland, which have high cost of living like Hawaii, they also are spending anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 more.
Mm-hmm. So there's, but you know, there's also somewhat of an unevenness, not necessarily in salaries, but in circumstance among our schools, depending on what communities they're in as well. Is that right?
Well, I give these statistics. Hawaii is last in the nation when it comes to the percent of taxation that goes to education. We are last in the nation when it comes to the amount of funding, teacher pay in the nation. We are last in the nation when it comes to capital improvement projects. So we do lead the country, though, in the amount of people that go to private school.
Yes.
Okay, so we have this system that has created that, you know, parents are sending their kids to private schools and spending a tremendous amount of tuition. But if a parent does not have that kind of, income, then what's happening is, and this is what happened here at Campbell, you're going to have 35, 40 kids in a classroom.
By the way, Campbell High School, how many students overall?
I saw this morning, a teacher posted 3,200 plus.
3,200 plus.
And it is growing without any more resources to build a new high school.
Yes.
Okay, so we're literally bursting at the seams. But at Campbell, you know, it was 90, 100 degrees in our classroom, 35 to 40 kids. We had 100 new teachers in the last 4 years. You know, it's over half of our staff has turned over in that time. And we're serving, you know, a middle class to poor community. This is not what we know is good for our students. And we cannot continue this path where we believe that if we don't invest in our children, it is good for our society. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It is good for our society, it is good for our economy, and we're often too short-sighted when we don't invest in children.
So if you just following a student at Campbell with over 3,000 other students, it seems to me it would be possible for a lot of students to just be lost in this.
We have about 900 freshmen.
900?
900 freshmen, which is just as big, I think, as some of our high schools.
Yes.
Okay? But the sad part is that our graduating class is probably going to be about 600. Now, one of the big questions we have to ask our society is, what happened to those 300 kids?
Where are they? Yes.
Where are they?
Yes.
Okay? And as a teacher, when you have 40 kids, it's very easy to get lost. Let's just say I have an essay my kids are writing, and each student needs help, and I can give them help for 1 minute. That's 40 minutes.
That's it.
Okay? And that's assuming that I did nothing else during the day. Okay?
Right.
Or it takes, in 1 minute, I can magically teach the kid how to write an essay or get help. The reality is that, and that's also, by the way, I require my kids to write 3 to 5 page essays. That means I'm getting 100, 200 pages for that one class.
Yes.
And that's not including the 3 other classes I have to teach. Some of our teachers have anywhere from 150 to 180 kids on their roster.
I'm guessing that giving essays is not the most popular strategy for many teachers.
So,
Yeah.
you know,
If they have a big family or anything at home,
so
right?
try to imagine if you have, say in our private schools, you might have 40 or 50 or 60 kids, and that's a lot easier to manage than it is 180.
Yes.
And that's why the class size we have and class load is so important. But all of it comes back to the funding.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening right now is inflation is going up, but the amount we're investing in the schools is staying the same.
Right.
And even the way it wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just a simple thing. Okay, here it is, $8,000 for a regular public student. And right now, I think the Star Advertiser said about 2 weeks ago, it's about $27,000 right now for Punahou.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so I often hear at times when people say, you know what, the DOE is wasteful.
Mm-hmm.
We give them plenty of money and they're wasting it. Well, my response to that is Punahou must be very wasteful. Because evidently with $27,000 per student compared to $8,000, I mean, how much waste is that? But the reality is that is pretty close to what you need to do to make sure that you invest in children.
I know by looking at statistics over the past that Hawaii's average high school enrollment a couple of years ago was twice the national average. The same thing for elementary and middle school. And there was actually a policy of wanting to have large schools, right? Do you think the size of the school itself is an issue here?
I know 3,200 is not the way to go.
Yeah.
I watched at like when we have breaks and kids are moving to class, it's just so many kids. I mean,
Yes.
it's just to put it into perspective, there are more students at Campbell High School than on the entire island of Lanai.
Yes.
Okay? And so we have like our own small city there. I do like the idea of smaller schools. I was at Roosevelt, and I think we were probably like half to a third of the size of Campbell, and I knew most of the kids.
Yes.
And I like that idea of doing this. I think though, one of the benefits of a large school is the type of class that we can offer. We can offer more diversity, but I don't think that should be limited by having a large class, a large school. I think that what needs to happen is, one of the big focuses that we miss on this case is that we have many students that will go to college, and that is a great goal, but many of our students are not.
Mm-hmm.
That does not mean that they should not get trained. I mean, we need to be offering vocational training for our students so that when they leave high school, they are well trained to get a high-paying job. Currently, if many of our public school students, you have a huge chunk that drops out, maybe up to a third of students, they go to, and of the students that graduate, half of them may not even go to college.
That's right.
And the half that go to college, half of them are going to drop out. So we have this huge amount of students. Some estimates are up to about 80% of our students that are not finishing college, and they have no education beyond high school or even finishing that degree. And we need to make sure that this group can go on and have a prosperous career. And there are many things. Listen, I'm very good at social studies. I'm horrible with my hands. I couldn't fix my car. But there are some of my students that love their cars. They're very good mechanics. Why not train them so that when they leave high school, that they can go get a job and do this? And that applies for culinary or carpentry or electricians. I mean, we should be offering our students many possibilities so that they can leave high school with the training that they need.
And beyond the job as a goal, there's also this notion of preparing future citizens,
Yes.
which is sort of your Kuleana.
Social
as
studies,
social
yes.
studies, right? You know, how well do you think we're doing that? To put it right back in your social studies lap here, you know?
Hawaii has the lowest voter turnout in the nation.
Right.
And Hawaii's 18 to 25-year-olds are the lowest voters in the lowest state with the voter
yeah.
turnout. We need to increase that. And so a radical proposal, although I think Nancy Pelosi suggested this earlier too, is we need to lower the voting age to 16. I used to register all my students to vote. Some states have actually made that illegal. Florida recently, it was a couple years ago, made it illegal for basically teachers just to register the students. And we need to go the other way. I mean, we teach our kids so many things in school. How about the ability to vote? Wouldn't it be great if we could register all these 16-year-olds while they're in school and get it in that 16 to 18 part? There's going to be an election. And wouldn't it be great if these kids, while they're still in high school, would have an opportunity to vote for their first time? Instead, they leave high school, they're not registered, and then we lose that opportunity.
So there is a course, though, on preparing students for democracy, a one semester one,
Yes,
right?
I taught that participation
You
democracy.
taught that participation, and there was actually a fight a few years ago where the Board of Ed
Yes.
wanted to make it non-compulsory, right? Is that one course enough of a background for active student citizenship engagement, preparing them?
During that class, I taught my kids how to be activists, how to testify, how to go to the Capitol. But I registered them to vote and told them all about voting. But like any skill, it's great if you have real world application. So
Right.
it would have been wonderful to register them and get them to vote during that time period. And that's one of the things that, is one of the possibilities.
There is a student council at every school, I assume, but we really don't ask students to help run the school, do we? Is that something that being a citizen is more than voting once every 2 years. It's engagement, it's knowing how to be on a committee, how to make decisions, how to work with people. Is that something where you think we're enhancing the student meaningful engagement at the school level might contribute?
It can. I mean, it was interesting to see when my students did their activism projects, how many of them chose to do projects at the school. It was interesting, and they had never gone through the process. For example, they were trying to get vending machines at the school because they said we couldn't get bottled water. And during the day, we're getting thirsty, and it's hot, and we want bottled water. And so my students learned, okay, they started researching, what do we need? They started going through the administration, and I think that for them was a powerful tool in how to be part of a democracy. They're just, learning how to be active.
So, so we have a course. We have some very active teachers like yourself, but as you say, it doesn't seem to be sticking, for that generation, right? There's more to be done in citizenship education, you think?
Again, I think it goes back to investing in our children. What does society say to them when we basically, so like right now, across the state, it's supposed to be 91 degrees today. And it's gonna be 5 or 10 degrees hotter in a classroom. Now I want you to imagine being in a sauna for 6 hours and trying to learn. And these kids do as best as they can. But eventually you get exhausted, you get tired, and that's just the teachers.
Yes.
And I think at some point you think, well, what does society think about me? Why do this, okay? Why are there so many kids in my classroom? Why can't I have a computer or Wi-Fi system? Why is it our books are 20 years old? Some kids may be saying, why is this my third teacher this year?
Yes.
And we're saying to these kids sometimes we don't value. We're not willing to invest in you. Now try to imagine too, again, let's take the opposite example. Let's look at this Punahou student. And they're gonna go into an environment, trust me, if a Punahou parent had to have their child in a 100-degree classroom, they would be screaming, and if they had to go to the public schools, it would be a very different situation. But they put them in this environment that's conducive. There's 16 kids in the class, you know, their teacher has been at Punahou for multiple years. They feel valued.
They feel valued, and
Okay.
valuing teachers and students is very much a part of what you've been talking about. We've been talking with Corey Rosenlee, the president of the Hawaii State Teachers Association. We'll be back in 1 minute.
This is Alice Lee Hagan, host of ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My show here at ThinkTech Hawaii is every Thursday from 3 to 4 in the afternoon. I bring in interesting guests from Hawaii, the mainland, and hopefully international guests in the future. Do join us on Thursday from 3 to 4 p.m. ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Aloha.
Aloha, my name is PJ and I'm the host of Hawaii Sports Update. I am very interested in local sports, and that's why I host the Hawaii Sports Update show. I bring in guests from Hawaii, I bring in guests from UH, I bring in guests from the community, I bring in big names, I bring in small names, I bring in all names that are community related and doing positive things, sports related in the community. Come join me every Tuesday at 1 p.m. here on Hawaii Sports Update. You can also join me on my golf tournament, the first annual PJ Sports Radio Show golf tournament. It's going to be held at Coral Creek. For any information, go to ThinkTech Hawaii INC and friend us. The PayPal and a summary of the event will be right there available for you. And don't forget to tweet us.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, Reformers. We're talking with Corey Rosenlee, the head of HSTA. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what those public schools are and what would move them forward. I understand that the average or entrance salary for a teacher is about $43,000 or something in that area, and the average of all is about 53, 54?
55, yeah.
55, okay. So looking down the road, HSTA negotiates. What does that look like in 5 years?
You know, the first thing I look at is what are the best school systems in the world doing? Okay, and what do they do differently than what do we do? And I think there's something called what I call the big three.
Okay.
The best school system in the world is Finland. You could, you know, you look at some of the private schools in Hawaii, okay? You said let's just for now say Punahou, and you look at our college system. What do these things share in common? First thing is it is highly selective in order to be a teacher in these environments. In Finland, out of 100 people that apply to be a teacher, only 10% get in. In Hawaii, we have anywhere from 50 to 70% of our new teachers are emergency hires. The school year is starting, and we don't have people to fill the classroom. In fact, in Lanai, there was a story that came out, they went for most of the year without people to fill their classroom. This is not what we should be doing for our classrooms. And you mentioned the starting salary, let's say, I think it's $44,000. But most of these new teachers that are emergency hires are actually getting paid about $35,000.
Oh.
And so what it means is that this is very cheap for the Department of Education, but this means that a lot of these teachers are, you know, inexperienced, and then some of them can be really great teachers, but this is not what we should be aiming for. And a lot of these teachers are also going to our poorest schools. And these schools constantly have this turnover rate. That's what's happening at Campbell. So what happens when we compared Hawaii's teacher salaries to districts that have similar cost of living, you find that teachers there can make anywhere from 60 to 90% better. I mean, what would happen in Hawaii if teaching salaries started at $60,000? The question is, would more people want to go into teaching? The answer is yes. Could we be more selective in doing this? Would we keep on having these teacher turnover rates? And we wouldn't. The question is, are we willing to do that?
So just looking at the starting salary, what's the price tag of bringing it up to ballpark competitive, you think?
I think we were about $300 million more.
300 million.
We could be able to move our salaries up to a competitive level. And I think long term, what we need to look at is, okay, I always find it very short-sighted that as a society, we don't want to invest in all of our children. So one thing is teacher salaries. The next thing is our capital improvement projects budget in Hawaii is about $100 million short each year. Short.
Mm-hmm.
So this means that projects keep on being pushed back. You look at Farrington's High School's auditorium. That had been on the waiting list
Yes.
to be fixed for years.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it finally collapsed, people said, oh, it was an act of nature. It was not an act of nature. People knew that roof was going to fall in. And an hour later, there would have been a poetry slam in that auditorium. There would have been kids in that auditorium, and people would have been injured or killed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, what is it going to take for us to say, okay, that is horrible. Now, Campbell, 3,200 students, there's no funding for a new high school. So where are these kids eventually going to go? Air conditioning. They say there's no funding for it. So every time we get into these issues, the thing is no funding.
Mm-hmm.
And even like class size, again, with funding, we could bring something down. That is what the big three do. Finland, low class sizes. You have well-trained professional teachers in the classroom. These teachers are given academic freedom. And trust me, they heat the classrooms in Finland, okay?
All right.
But if you look at our private schools, they're air conditioned. Our
Uh-huh.
colleges are air conditioned.
Mhm.
Low class sizes again. It's not like the model of what's needed for education has to be so extreme.
Yes.
We know what needs to be done. We just are not doing it.
Mm-hmm. So, and this is supposedly a democratic state, presumably more interested in public education. Have you had conversations with legislators and others about the likelihood, the possibility, are you moving the needle in their brains a little bit more?
Well, it's 3 weeks.
Yeah, 3 weeks,
But
yeah.
we need, the problem is we don't have a sense of urgency.
Yes.
Part of the problem is that 20% of the population sends their kids to private schools. In the Honolulu area, it's close to 40%.
40%, yeah.
And not to belittle our politicians, but they send their kids to private school at a much even higher rate.
Yeah.
And so what it comes down to is, if you look across the country, you hear politicians saying we need to invest in schools. We need to invest in our children. And the sad part is you don't hear that here.
Mm-hmm.
Where is a person saying, you know what, oh my goodness, our teacher lowest pay, we need to change this.
Yes.
This conversation is not having. So one of the important things that, what I'm gonna try to do as president of HSTA is to try to change this conversation while I'm here today.
Yes.
Is so that we start thinking about, okay, this is our current situation, it needs to change.
Mm-hmm.
Are we as a society willing to invest in our children to do what we know is the best way to educate children?
Mm-hmm.
This is where we want to be. It is not a mystery. Can we get there?
Mm-hmm. Do you see the public business community as being supportive of this need, even if it's a matter of, well, we just can't have 30, 40% of our kids out on the streets without an education?
As a society, it's short-sighted not to invest in education. Studies show that if you invest in education, long-term it is good for the economy, it reduces social costs, it's good for the government, but oftentimes we're stuck in this place where we say, okay, we don't want to do these things. And the sad part is that's not what's happening around the world.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to look at a lot of these economies that are improving, Singapore is a great example. Singapore had very little natural resources. So they made the decision that they were going to invest in their people. And now Singapore has one of the best education systems in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Their college graduates, the top college graduates, they recruit them to go into education.
Mm-hmm.
Trust me when I say no one was recruiting me when I was leaving my bachelor's degree. I mean, and what we forget is our teachers have bachelors, they have masters, some of them even have doctorates. They have these very skilled things, biology, or even auto mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
And they have choices. And they can go into the private world and they can be making more money. Or even the auto mechanics teacher. I mean, seriously, imagine the experience this auto mechanics teacher has, and he wants to do well for kids, but they have families and they have expenses and they have choices. And so the question then is are we willing to keep these teachers?
So it sounds like you're drifting towards the notion of some other tax base or other dedicated tax source for education. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of the things I'd like to do is something called the Schools Our Cake You Deserve campaign. And we need to look at how we're going to fund our schools. The interesting thing is Hawaii's taxation system was set up to make sure our schools were underfunded. When Hawaii's public schools were in its infancy, the Big Five, the sugar planters, controlled Hawaii. And when it came to funding their schools, they said, we do not want to pay for the children of our plantation workers to have a better life. In fact, one plantation manager said, if you educate them beyond the 6th grade, they'll become a menace. Okay? And so they purposely underfunded the public schools, and then they sent their kids to the private schools. So Hawaii's class system when it comes to our schools was not by mistake, it was by design. And the question then is this. As a country, we said it was wrong to segregate children by race, that white children should not get more funding and better schools than black children. Are we also ready to say, as a country, as a state, that a child should not get segregated by schools based on their parents' income? That a child from a poor neighborhood should have the same opportunity, the same chance in life to get a good education. And what we know is good education is something that we need to fund.
I know in Human Services, the Director of Human Services just recently told a group that the greatest determinant of health is your zip code, right?
Yes.
And that seems to be very true throughout the United States and even in Hawaii. And even though we have more or less equal funding, the nature of what that community can provide supports is very different from an upper middle class to industrial.
And there's this, what happens in Hawaii, I believe, is all equal. But again, so let's take it for example. One of my favorite examples to look at is in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia public schools, it costs about $11,000 to educate children. And the Philadelphia public schools is about 80% black or Hispanic. Inside Philadelphia is like a little town called Lower Merion, 85% white. Mm-hmm. And they spend twice as much on a student at Lower Merion. Okay? So these Hispanic children, these minority children, black children are getting half as much. See, in Hawaii, you can live anywhere you want to. Hawaii has the lowest property taxes in the nation. And instead of paying those property taxes and investing in schools, what happens is instead of those property taxes, you take your child and you can send them to a private school for $15,000 or $20,000 and make sure that your child gets a good education. But what are we doing as a society to say, well, if you don't have that money, then a child from a zip code where it may be not as wealthy, who's going to invest in that child? So it's still by race, it's still by wealth.
It does sound like not only maybe standards for learning, we need standards for nurturing learning, funding learning, the whole ball of wax for an excellent school system. And you're working on that, I can see. We've been talking with Corey Rosenlee, the president of the Hawaii State Teachers Association. Thank you very much. We'll be back next week.